Hey folks, welcome to Human Anatomy Biotechnology, another edition of Ed Puzzle by your fabulous and amazing Ms. McFadden and Mrs. Stricker. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the muscular system, its functions and what it does and why it does those things. So you can follow along with me in your note packet and fill out your notes as we talk. And I will try to make sure that you have everything that you need information-wise in that packet. So first, a couple of things about muscles. One of the things that we know people do is that a lot of people like to lift weights, and we exercise our muscles. And so one of the questions that we always ask our students is, why do we do that? So I'm going to pull that up in the Ed Puzzle right now so you can answer that question. People have different motivations for lifting weights. One of the reasons that some people lift weights is they like the way that fit and trim muscles look. And it's important to exercise our muscles because they're the organ that does the primary work for our body. So if we keep them toned and in shape, we'll be able to function just in general in our movement much more successfully. So a couple of things about the muscular system. There are over 600 muscles that make up your musculatory system, and that comprises about 45% of your total body weight if you're an adult. Now, some of us have more muscle mass than others, and if we compare males to females, in fact, males have a significant more percentage of their bodies that's actual muscle fiber than females do. That's not always the case, but that's a general gender rule. Muscles, when we talk about them, are really these long fibers or these really long skinny cells that are held together by connective tissue. And we'll talk a little bit about connective tissue, but you've seen connective tissues before if you've ever done a dissection or prepared chicken at home, maybe. Those muscle fibers, those long, slender cells, are stimulated by nerves. They contract, so they get short and thick, and their contraction causes movement of some kind. And that's what happens with all of the muscles in our body. And those muscle fibers are made up of these tiny myofilaments that we call actin and myosin. And so when we look at the structure of muscles in a little while, we're going to see sort of repeating units bundled together. And that's what creates what we call an overall muscle. When we talk about muscles, there are some prefixes that refer to muscle. So anytime you see the prefix myo, mys, or sarco, we're referring to muscle groups. And scientists generally like to keep prefixes similar so that we know what we're talking about. Those Latin prefixes are really important. So again, if I talk about myofilaments, I'm talking about muscle filaments. There are some other words that we can look at prefix-wise that can help us understand more about muscles too. So spaz means to draw or to pull. So when we think about what we call a spasm, when your muscle is like twitching, that's drawing or pulling on your muscle. Tens means to stretch. So tension has something to do with muscle stretching or pulling or being tight. Plegia, that's a suffix. That means paralysis, and you've heard it in a couple of different ways. You might hear paraplegia or quadriplegia. Paraplegia indicates some level of paralysis, usually not including all four limbs. Quadriplegia would include paralysis that includes the entire four limbs of our body, so from the neck down. The prefix therap means treatment, so when we talk of therapy, that's some kind of a treatment for sure. Therm means heat, and then dynam means power. So when we talk about dynamic stretching or dynamic lifting, those are power lifts or power stretches that we might use involving our muscles. Okay, so this is kind of long. The properties and functions of muscles, you can fill this out while I talk about it really quickly. And we'll go into more detail on most of this a little bit later on in our unit. But all of our muscles are going to respond to some kind of a stimulus. And usually that's what we call a neurotransmitter stimulus or a hormone stimulus that's released into our bodies. And once those muscles respond to that stimulus, they're going to create an electrical current or an action potential. So the stimulus creates that electrical current, and our muscles are going to respond. The different kinds of muscles that we have in our body are going to respond differently to that electrical current, or what we call an action potential. Skeletal muscles are going to respond pretty quickly and forcefully, but then they also relax really quickly. Visceral muscle, which is the muscle that's inside some of your organs, your smooth organs, is going to respond really slowly to that current and take a long time to contract. And then finally, the other kind of muscle that we're going to talk about in a bit is cardiac muscle. And obviously, cardiac muscle is going to have a really fast response. And if you think about your heart, that's a good example of that. So we have a constant fast response, so much faster than visceral muscle. And our contraction is a lot stronger, but it lasts for a really long time. So we have a longer duration of contraction in our cardiac muscle. Okay, so when we're talking about muscles, the way that they work is they actually shorten. So we call that contraction, and they shorten with some force. They can extend or be stretched, but the way that they always cause movement is by contracting. That's how muscles work. All of our muscles are elastic, which means that they are going to resume their original length after they've been stretched. And some of our muscles are automatic, which means they contract without a nerve supply. We call this reflex. When we talk about muscle functions, there are a variety of different functions that our muscles do all the time. When we think about muscles, most of the time we think about movement. So we have locomotion there. But we can't forget that our heart beating is a muscle that's being used all the time. And we also have to use muscles to move substances through the organs in our body that are hollow. So think about anytime you eat something and you swallow and you have to get that food down your esophagus, that's muscle movement. Or anytime we're moving the food in our stomach through our intestines and out of our digestive tract, all of that's going to be muscle movement. Our muscles also maintain our posture, so they hold us upright. They stabilize our joints so that the points where our bones come together aren't all wobbly and loose. They are really important in that homeostasis of our body temperature. So they're going to generate heat, and they also provide some protection to those really important internal organs. Sorry, sometimes this goes backwards. Okay, I've already mentioned the three types of muscle, but this is a spot where we can talk a little bit more about them. The first is the cardiac muscle, and it is only found in your heart. That's the only place you'll find it. Your heart, made of cardiac muscle, has a lot of what we call banding in it. So if you take a look at a picture here, this banding right here is it's striations in that muscle tissue, and our cardiac muscle has a ton of mitochondria in it. So I want you to think back to maybe your biology class and think about what mitochondria in the cell does. And if you're thinking that through with me, you know that mitochondria takes sugar and converts it into usable energy in our cells. So one of the questions that's going to pop up in the ed puzzle here in a minute is, why does our cardiac muscle have so much mitochondria in it? So I want you to propose a reasoning for that in that ed puzzle answer. And then also, our cardiac muscle is involuntary, which means we don't have to tell our heart muscle to keep beating, to keep pumping. It does that on its own, so totally involuntary. The next kind of muscle that we're going to talk about is what we call visceral muscle, or maybe smooth muscle. This muscle is found on the internal organs of the body. It lines the digestive system, the respiratory system, and our blood vessels. And remember, our blood vessels can constrict or dilate, so there are muscles involved in that movement as well. The reason it's called smooth muscle is it doesn't have any of those little tiny lines that you see in the cardiac muscle and in the skeletal muscle, so we call it smooth muscle. Our smooth muscle is completely involuntary. We don't have to tell it to contract. And When our visceral muscles are actually contracting, those contractions are really steady and constant. The last type of muscle is the kind of muscle that you all think about when we talk about muscle, and that's skeletal muscle. It's about 40% of our body is made up of skeletal muscle, and it's the muscle that's primarily involved in movement. It has a lot of the striations. Skeletal muscle is voluntary, which means we have to send a signal to tell our muscles to contract the way that we need them to. They also contract rapidly, right? They're going to get tired easily, but they do produce much more power than the other types of muscle that we've talked about. So, when we're talking about skeletal muscle, we know that that muscle attaches to bones. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the anatomy of that. The way that our muscles attach to our bone is through tendons, and tendons are these strong, tough connective tissues that actually hold those muscles to our bones. Um, a good example of that is our Achilles tendon, which is found at the back of our ankle. And that tendon's a big tendon. It's very thick. You can feel it through your ankle. If you grab your ankle right now, you'll be able to feel that tendon. And the Achilles tendon actually attaches your gastrocnemius muscle, which is your calf muscle, to your heel bone. So without those tendons, our muscles wouldn't attach appropriately to our bones. And if you think about connective tissue, you know how strong it is. So tendons can be really strong and hold those muscles on the bones where they belong. Muscles also have what we call an origin and an insertion. So two sides to every muscle. An origin of a muscle is the end that doesn't move. And so what happens with that origin is that it stays in its original position. The insertion is the end that moves when the muscle contracts. So in the Ed puzzle, you're going to have a question that pops up here in just a minute. I want you to think about your hamstring. That's the muscle that runs down the back of your leg. So I want you to think about which bone is the origin of the hamstring. Where does that origin point of your muscle attach? And then which bone has the insertion of the hamstring? So the end of the muscle that's going to actually cause movement. So think about that for a minute. Okay, so some rules to know for muscles, and there are more than 5 of these, but these are the 5 that we thought were really important. First is what we just talked about. A muscle has to have 2 attachments, 2 points that it connects. So we talked about the origin and the insertion. And always, muscles will span over a joint because remember, the whole purpose of a muscle is to have movement. Number 2 is one we already talked about. When muscles contract, they always shorten and they always pull. We don't have muscles that push. We can contract our muscles and do a pushing motion, but our muscles themselves always pull. They always contract. Number 3, the fibers in our muscles, those long, slender cells, always point to the attachment. And number 4, we talked about this just a minute ago, the side that moves is going to be called the attachment, and the side that is stationary is called the origin. So it stays totally still on that side. And the last rule that we're going to talk about is that muscles always work in pairs. So if you have a muscle that causes a movement in one direction, you're going to have another muscle that causes a movement in the opposite direction. So they're always paired. And that's why when you work out, if you have a really good workout, your workout is going to work both pairs of muscles. It's not going to be great for your overall fitness if you only work one muscle and not the opposite pair. Okay, so when we talk about skeletal muscles contracting, we know that the force of the contraction with a muscle fiber is that it happens completely. So that means if a muscle fiber is stimulated, it's going to contract fully. There's no half contraction here. So if you stimulate a muscle fiber, that whole fiber is going to contract. However, there's a big difference between picking up something really light, like a pencil, when I pick up a pencil like this, versus picking up really something heavy, like picking up a brick or a big textbook. And the difference is if you pick up a pencil, something really light, every muscle fiber that you are using is fully contracting, but you're not using all of your muscle fibers to pick up that pencil. Whereas if you pick up something really heavy, all of those muscle fibers are contracting as well. You're just contracting a greater number of muscle fibers. So we say muscle contraction is either all or none. There's no halfway there. Okay, when we talk about muscles, we can also talk about types of muscle fibers. And if you've ever been involved in athletics, maybe your coach has talked about some of these. The first type is called a red slow twitch fiber. These fibers are a little bit different because they're thin. They have a red color because they have a lot of a myoglobin protein that carries oxygen. So they're going to look red to us. These slow twitch fibers are really resistant to getting tired, to fatiguing. And what happens with your slow twitch fibers is that they're going to use aerobic pathways that provide more energy. So they're going to have an oxygen supply that's going to provide your body with a lot more energy. And when we look at somebody like a marathon runner, they're going to have a lot of red slow twitch fibers because those fibers are going to be really resistant to getting tired. They're not going to tire easily. And they're going to be able to sustain contraction for a long time. So they have a slower contraction with much less power. The other type of muscle fibers that you have in your body are called white fast twitch fibers. And these fibers are much fatter, so their diameter is a lot bigger. They don't have as much oxygen carrying protein called myoglobin, and they're going to get tired much more quickly. However, they have a lot of energy reserves. And so what happens is they're a much shorter term, faster contraction. And so these contractions are going to be very powerful, lots and lots of power, but they're going to move very, very quickly. And so a sprinter, for example, is going to have a lot of fast twitch muscles. And I just want you to think about the physiology of a sprinter versus a marathon runner. A lot of times when we think about marathon runners, we're thinking about really lean, kind of long and lean runners. Whereas when we think about a sprinter, we think about sort of short and powerful legs, tree trunk legs, because they have such power in their muscles. So the difference between those two muscle fibers can be found in all sorts of athletes. And we kind of hone those muscle fibers based on what our skeletal muscle performance is. So the more sort of long, slow contraction you do, the more red slow twitch fibers you're going to develop. And the more sort of power, fast, quick movement that you're going to do to power your muscles, the more white, fast twitch fibers you're going to produce. Although a lot of our muscle fiber composition is genetic as well. Okay, so we've already talked about a little bit about muscle movement. We talked about origin and insertion. And we talked about how muscles have to work in pairs. And so when we talk about muscle interactions, that pairing of muscles is really important. The first muscle that is the primary mover, we call the agonist. And this is the muscle that's going to create the major force. It's going to be what starts the movement. And so when we talk about an agonist, we're talking about that big muscle that's doing the majority of the work. So when I am flexing my elbow, right, my bicep brachii is the agonist that's actually doing the work there. The antagonist is the muscle that has the opposite or reverse movement. And so in this example, when my triceps contracts, which is the muscle back here, it's going to pull my arm back open and extend my elbow. So I have the agonist that contracts to pull my arm up, and I have the antagonist that contracts to pull my arm back down. There's also a group of muscles that we can call synergists, and these synergists actually help support the agonist, that big muscle movement. And an example of that might be the muscles that help you make a fist without you bending your wrist. There's a lot of synergist muscles that are all working together to make that happen. And I don't know if this link is going to work, but we're going to try. Nope, not going to work. I wondered that. When I post this PowerPoint, you can click on that link and you can actually see and experiment with that agonist and antagonist sort of movement. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about, the last thing we're going to talk about really quickly is just the anatomy of a muscle and what it looks like. And we're going to be going into more detail about this when we talk about muscles in class. But I told you before, muscle fibers are those long, slender cells that make up our fiber or make up our muscles. And there are hundreds to thousands of muscle fibers per muscle. So lots of cells in each of our muscles. Technically, we call a muscle cell a muscle fiber, and it's made up of a lot of these myofibrils that we'll talk about in the next couple class periods. Those stinking presentation. Those myofibrils can either be thick or thin. And you've heard us talk about myosin and actin. That's what makes up these myofibrils. If you take a whole bunch of myofibrils and you put them together, then you have what's called a muscle fiber or simply a muscle cell. If you take a whole bunch of muscle cells or muscle fibers and you bundle them together, then you have what's called a fascicle, and you can see them bundled together here. And then if you take a whole bunch of fascicles and you bundle them together, you finally have the muscle that you are looking at, the primary muscle that you're looking at in skeletal muscle. And then there are some other terms here as well. If you take a look at this epimysium, this is connective tissue that surrounds your whole muscle. But there's connective tissue that connects the muscle fibers together into a fascicle and connective tissue that connects the fascicles together into a whole muscle. And so we'll talk about all of those different connective tissues. Endomysium is what is around each of the separate muscle fibers. And paramysium is what's around each of the fascicles, and epimysium is what is around the whole muscle itself. But all of those mysiums that I just talked about are made up of connective tissue. So I want you to think about eating some chicken. When you eat chicken and you kind of pull the meat apart, you know that it's long, right? It's got a grain to it, and that's because the muscle fibers all point one direction, right? We talked about that. But if you start to peel apart those long strands of muscle, you will see sort of some whitish, clearish tissue that holds those strands together. That's the connective tissue that surrounds that muscle. And then when we look at this picture of a muscle, don't forget, we also have that really, really strong connective tissue that's going to connect the muscle to the bone that we're attached to. And we'll talk more about muscle anatomy, but I wanted to give you a little bit of background before we start talking about that muscle anatomy in class together. Don't forget to fill out your notes. Submit either the Google document or a picture of your notes if you wrote them when you're finished with this ed puzzle, and answer the questions that pop up as you're watching this video. And I will see you next time. Thanks, guys.